On, so we're not here all night. Oh, it's 8:20. No, we're doing well. Good. You have everybody back? Go ahead, yeah.
Mr. Beckman was telling jokes at supper. And after I left, he made me think of a joke.
I'm sorry to all the rest of you.
There were two guys, you might find a useful application for this joke in your professional career, some of you. There were two fellas named Bill and Fred, and they used to go golfing every Saturday morning. For years, they went out, they would tee off at 7 o'clock in the morning, and they would always be back by noon. And Bill's wife, in particular, was quite happy with this arrangement because it meant that every Saturday morning she could do whatever personal stuff she wanted around the house or with herself. And Bill would be home around lunchtime, and they would go out and do things together in the afternoon, whether it was shopping or visiting or checking out a gallery or whatever. And one Saturday came along, and Bill's wife was particularly looking forward to this day because they had plans. And when it got to be time for him to be home, and he wasn't home, she started to get irritated. And then it was 1 o'clock, he was an hour late, and then he was 2 hours late, and she's mad. She's mad. Then it's 3 o'clock, and he's still not home. And she's beginning to get concerned. By the time supper rolls around, she isn't mad anymore at all. She's really worried, wondering what in the world happened. Finally, about 10:30 that night, after she'd phoned the police, and they did nothing for her at that point. Apparently there's a 24-hour thing. But Bill wanders in the door looking like he's been in a fight with a pool cat. His shirt is untucked, his hair's all messed up, he's got scratches and scars on him, he looks like he's been doing manual labor. She said, "Bill, what in the world happened to you? Where have you been all day? I've been worried sick." And Bill said, "You know that damn Fred, he went and had a heart attack on me in the second hole. And after that, for the rest of the whole game, it was hit the ball, drag Fred. Hit the ball, drag Fred." The first two parts of the workshop were, number one, the concept of paradigms, and that our perspective shapes what we see. And when that happens, we end up carrying fixed assumption patterns in our head that tell us what we're looking at. And that shapes the way we interact with reality. That shapes what we believe our options to be. It shapes what we believe our limitations to be. It isn't that we are limited or that we don't have options. It's that the paradigm constrains the way we think. You with me? The second thing we looked at was the concept of power. What is power? Power is the capacity to exert your will upon someone else. It's one person or one group of persons with the ability to impose your will upon others, including upon those who aren't interested in submitting to you. That's the definition of power. The source of power is personality, property, and, anybody know? Organization. Personality, property, organization. That's where power comes from. If you can't gain access to one of those sources, you don't have it. It's that simple. The levers that express it is the capacity to reward someone, which is a free market. That's what the free market is. It's not coercive. The difference between that lever and the free market, it's never coercive. You submit to it, but it's not coercive. In government, the government has power because it can punish you. Effectively, for any of us, the truth is that if you don't do what the government tells you to do, at some point somebody with a gun is going to come and knock on your door and haul you away to be dealt with. That's the only reason government has power. There's no other reason. Government can punish you. And in fact, governments spend most of their time establishing rules that you are going to be compelled to live by, and if you don't, there will be a punishment. The third lever of power, and arguably the most significant, is the capacity to shape, define, or mold what people believe about things. Paradigms, the first thing we talked about, don't just happen. They're shaped They're made the same way you bake a cake. Anybody here ever bake a cake? You can bake a paradigm. And there are people in this country who have been baking paradigms for decades. Pierre Trudeau didn't just happen, neither did Tommy Douglas. It isn't just that everybody woke up one day and thought, this is a good idea, let's let the government run everything. It didn't happen like that. There are processes that unfolded that shaped the dynamic or the paradigm within which all those things were occurring. And there were people who were baking cakes all throughout that last century. Let's look at how. Understanding paradigms and the levers of power facilitates strategic planning. It allows you to develop schematics and strategic plans, whether you're a constituency association, some other independent third-party group, or a political party. Those two things you need to keep in mind before you implement a strategy, or the context within which you're working is not complete. You'll only be seeing part of what you should be looking at. But first, there are 3 prerequisite ground rules that come into play prior to developing your strategic approach. The first rule is that policy is not a power source. Remember, we just looked at Galbraith's assumptions, or Galbraith's assertion. Galbraith defined 3 sources of power and 3 levers of power. You'll remember that the sources are personality, property, and organization. Does any of those 3 spell policy? Rule 1, policy is not a power source. You think in strategy, how you're going to do stuff. If you're a grower organization, you're thinking, how are we going to do this? Usually the first place we go is policy, because we think we're in a policy war. But policy is not a power source. Rule 2, policy is not a power source. It's a reminder. There are 3 sources. None of them are power. Rule 3, policy is not a power source. Now, the 3 sources, again, described by Galbraith. When you leave here tonight, I keep repeating this because I want you to go out tonight, or hopefully leave this workshop with those 3 ideas ringing through your head. The 3 sources of power are personality, property, and organization. Notice that the above rules don't say that policy doesn't matter. That's not what I'm saying, and that's not what this presentation is saying. Don't leave here tonight thinking Avram said policy doesn't matter. That's not what I'm saying. Don't misunderstand. Policy matters. We're not talking about whether policy matters or not here. We're talking about sources of power. That's 2 different discussions. Policy does matter. Policy is what the whole process is about. But that doesn't change the fact that while having good policy is essential to your values, it's essential to your position, and it's essential to your objective, and I would argue even your own self-respect. In and of itself, policy is not a power source. Now, we're not going to have time to get into this tonight, but if somebody wants to, I'm prepared to discuss it. But some of you who have studied rhetoric may come up with the whole idea of pathos, ethos, and logos. And if you want to discuss some of that tonight, we can later on. I would just simply say at this point that the context of this presentation of power is being put forward as presented by people who have academics who have given a lot of thought to this. My belief is that Galbraith is one of he was a left winger actually, really well. But he was a colleague of he and Kennedy were good friends of JFK. But that doesn't change the fact he wasn't a brilliant man. He truly was. He was a farm kid from Ontario.
Did he develop time study for speeding up simple processes?
I don't know.
No, that's this different guy.
Same last name, but a different family, yeah.
Yeah. This is I thought I would put together an image gallery kind of with just a handful of pictures to help us break the policy-only paradigm. Remember we looked at old paradigms and new paradigms, and we looked at ironclads and some of the other things? The policy-only paradigm is the old paradigm. That's the clipper ships, the 50-gun, the 140-gun Duke of Wellington. That's the policy-only old paradigm. The new paradigm. Now here, to put the truth of the concept that policy is not the power source into a useful context. Think of military ordnance and its delivery. The delivery of military ordnance, the number of allies you have delivering it, the manner and timing of the delivery, rather than its existence, is what defeats opponents and wins wars. The picture on the top right is a cruise missile. It's a delivery mechanism. It delivers ordnance. If the ordnance is parked on a ship or sitting in a back room somewhere, it's of no value. It doesn't matter how good it is. Delivery. Those stealth bombers, I don't know if any of you have ever seen those stealth bombers blanketing some of that stuff that happened in the Middle East. It was absolutely frightening. One of the most awesome personal experiences I ever had was Becky and I lived in Arizona for a short time. We're Canadian. She grew up in Ontario, and my hometown is Rollo, Saskatchewan. But we were at a ball game. We were at a Diamondbacks ball game one time, getting toward the end of the season, and they had a B-2 stealth bomber fly over, real low. Like, it is. I've never been in the presence where I knew there was so much power here. It's just stunning, just to even recognize what it was. This is a Canadian aircraft carrier. Canada had 3 aircraft carriers at one point. This is the Bonaventure. It was mothballed some years ago, but that's what that is. Canada, I understand, had the 3rd largest navy in the world at one time. But it's the capacity to deliver. There were 34 or 35 fighters on that flat top. If the planes were just kind of parked in Halifax or, Airdrie, Alberta, they'd be nice planes still. But it's the capacity to deliver them. This is one of the U.S. government's ammunition storage facilities. I understand a lot of this is in Nevada. If you drive through Nevada, you'll find storage facilities of armaments because of humidity and so on. And on the bottom right, those are the Canadian soldiers at Caen. Canada landed on Juno Beach on D-Day, and there were 1,000 casualties roughly. There were about 350 Canadians died. Canada's 3rd Division actually got farther inland on, this is a bit of a side issue, but Canada's 3rd Division actually got farther inland on D-Day than any of the other forces that made. Break the policy-only paradigm. There are 3 glasses here. Imagine that this one is strategic planning. Just call it strategic planning, a schematic drawing. Picture it as that. Imagine this one is communication know-how and resource development, and imagine that this glass is policy. This is now moved down here. Look at what's happened to the fluid levels in all these glasses. It isn't that you reduce policy. It isn't that you're saying you should throw policy out the window. It doesn't matter. It does matter. This does not suggest that policy is unimportant. It is to recognize that other factors must be emphasized in a more deliberately calculated fashion if the overall objective is to be achieved. If policy were enough, Bob Stanfield would have been Prime Minister of Canada, and one of the guys that I really like, Bob Dole, would have been President of the United States. He wasn't, despite the fact that his policies compared to his opponent were, he was a wonderful man. He was a senator from Kansas, just a terrific guy. You are not involved in a war of ideas or policy battle. Policy defines your position. I don't want to be repetitive. Skip to the next one. World War II was sparked by a policy values clash. World War II emerged as a result of policy, but was won or lost due to a contest that relied on strategy, logistics, and the development and delivery of resources that didn't exist in 1939, but that were in great abundance by 1945. It was the capacity to develop resources that won World War II. Yes, our policies were better than the other guys, that's true. But just because your policies are better than the other guys doesn't mean you win the war. You don't win because you're right. You don't win because you think your intentions are better or more honorable than the other guy. Sincerity is not a measure of virtue. Some of the greatest, most horrendous acts ever committed by humanity were committed by men and women who were 100% sincere. about whatever it was that we're doing. So the idea that you're sincere and you think your policies are better than the other guys, that's tough. That's going to get you nowhere. The last point is that lousy commanders and armies of weaklings react to what others are doing. Lousy commanders and armies of weaklings actually spend their time figuring out what the other guy is doing, and then they react to it. They're in a perpetual mode of reaction. It's constant. Victorious armies do the opposite thing. If you look at when Grant arrived to take command of the Union Army during the American Civil War, the commander ahead of him was a guy named George McClellan, who did exactly that. McClellan was some refer to him as a coward, but McClellan, in many instances, had resources, men, and material that vastly outnumbered his opponent, but he wouldn't attack. All he would do is react. And when Grant came in and took control of the Union Army, Grant changed the paradigm. He convinced his commanders and so on. I won't go into a lot of detail on this, but if you guys want to talk about it later, we can. The last guy I'll mention is MacNaughton. MacNaughton is actually a Canadian general. During World War II, he developed a new technology related to ranging techniques, in order to pinpoint where artillery was. He actually patented, he personally put a patent on the technology that he developed. He later on sold it to the Canadian government. I think he got $10 for it or something. It was just a gesture in order to transfer it. But because MacNaughton was able to take an aggressive approach, shifting the paradigm, his new paradigm provided the Canadians with the means to destroy over 80% of our enemy artillery during the Battle of Vimy Ridge. And it was MacNaughton who did that. And it's because MacNaughton could think outside the existing paradigm. Instead of accepting how things were already being done, he moved outside the 9 dots and developed a new way to approach it. I'm going to skip this page for the sake of time. Winds that drive change. Alberta has never been governed by an openly self-declared socialist political party. Does anybody disagree with that? Alberta has never been governed by an openly I'm not saying that we've never been governed by people who think socialist, but Alberta has never been governed by an openly self-declared socialist government, never. Yet Alberta's provincial government today promotes, maintains, and defends policies that would have been envied by any CCF-NDP party member just a single generation ago. And much of the general population seems to be in agreement. What happened?
Education.
What changed the paradigm? Education is one. You got it.
There are more people moving into the province. We had 100,000 a year coming into here, generally from a socialist province or...
So they shifted the paradigm? Would that be what you're saying?
They have different views, yeah.
Different views. A paradigm is a...
Yeah. No, you're...
Let's go on.
Yeah, there.
Now those are all factors, but let me suggest to you that what happened in a more profound way is that individuals who understood the sources and levers of power and the concept of paradigms deliberately set out and knowingly set out to systematically pull on the levers of power. There are guys early in the last century who understood very well the things we just finished talking about. They understood the concept of paradigms, they understood the levers of power, and they set out to use them. And in so doing, they shaped and largely defined the paradigm that is today considered by many to be the mainstream political attitude of the province and indeed of the country. Pierre Trudeau, I agree, sir, with your statement that you made earlier. I would add to that Mr. Trudeau just didn't wake up one morning and everybody said, well, let's jump on board and do this. There were factors leading to that we'll look at. At the bottom is a quote by Friedrich Hayek, who was the Nobel Prize winning economist in 1974, I think. In his book, The Road to Serfdom, he made this statement on the bottom. He said, socialists everywhere were the first to recognize that the task they set for themselves required the general acceptance of common Weltanschauung of a definitive set of values. I don't know if there's anybody here who speaks German, but Weltanschauung is a reference to worldview. It's I understand that in the old German language there's actually a kind of mystical dimension kind of woven into the idea, but it's a Weltanschauung means a worldview, a perspective of how you see the world. And Hayek is saying that early on socialists everywhere understood that they would never implement their agenda unless they could establish a common worldview or a definitive set of values. This is fun. This is E.A. Partridge. E.A. Partridge lived in Sinaloa, Saskatchewan. He was a farmer. He was a socialist. In 1905, Partridge made a trip to Winnipeg. He came back as a stump speaker. He was apparently quite an eloquent man. He made speeches all over the place. He is the guy who coined the phrase that the Winnipeg Commodity Exchange was a house with closed shutters. This is where it started. Partridge understood, let me tell you this about Partridge first. Partridge wanted to organize society into camps. He thought that each camp should have about 3,000 people, and he wanted elevators to be public utilities, grain elevators. And he also advocated the creation of a region called Coal-Sameo. He wanted to take all of British Columbia, that's the Co, and Alberta, and Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, and part of Ontario, and create it into one block, which would have been one political and economic block. Partridge founded, or was the first editor of the Grain Grower Grain Guide in 1908. There's actually a book written by Murray Catella, I think. It's called That Man Partridge. It's about Partridge's life. Many years later, Partridge actually became the honorary chairman of the National Farmers Union. We'll get into that. But the reason that he wanted to start the Grain Grower Grain Guide is that Partridge understood that if he could shape the attitudes of the people around his community, he could control what was going on. He understood it. Partridge's focus was on what people believe. The first nonprofit organization or advocacy group created in Alberta was actually the Western Stockgrowers Association. There were some things going on ahead of time, but in 1896, the purpose of the Western Stockgrowers Association was not to influence what people believed. It was to lobby government. Notice the difference. Partridge wanted to shape what people believed. The Western Stockgrowers Association wanted to lobby the politicians. That's not saying that's bad, it's just pointing out what their objective was. In fact, the Fort McLeod newspaper actually said that the purpose of the Western Stockgrowers was to provide a unified effort to stamp out wolves, control rustlers, secure protection against mistakes made when shipping cattle, and to convince the legislature that certain laws needed to be or not be in place. This is 1900, that's the year 2000. We're going to walk through this timeline and we're going to see who the guys were that shaped the paradigm. That's what this is for. Using power sources to define and shape the paradigm that is today controlling things. Partridge is 1905. This is William Irvine. William Irvine was a Calgarian. He was a socialist, a left-winger. He founded a newspaper in Calgary called the Nutcracker, which expressed progressive views. He too, like Partridge, understood that if he was going to shape political culture, you'd have to do it not by trying to just influence politicians, but by changing people. He was elected as a Labour MP from Calgary in 1921. He went to the House of Commons. He was a Labour MP from the city of Calgary in 1921. Here's the Western Stockgrowers. In 1917, so we're still here prior to the First War, at the beginning of the war, Harris Turner became a popular stump speaker, more eloquent, we're told, or I'm told, than even Partridge. He advocated an end to grain markets, socialized services, greater government control of the economy. He was actually in Saskatoon. His co-worker was a guy named Waldron. There were two of them that worked together. They understood exactly what they were doing. They were setting out in order to create the levers and the mechanisms that would shape how people believe about the appropriate role of government. In 1920, 3 years after Turner's Weekly News began, the Progressive Party was founded, political party. But the Progressive Party was not an actual party. It actually didn't have a structure. The Progressive Party was actually an affiliation or a coalition, mostly of agricultural organizations, all across the country. There were labor unions and intellectual socialists involved, but it was more of a coalescing together of existing groups. It wasn't a formal political party in the sense that many think it was. In 1924, let's go up here in 1921. So here in 1921, we've got William Irvine, a left-wing socialist from Calgary, getting elected, who had founded a newspaper. In 1921, the Progressive Party wins 15 of 16 seats in the federal election. In 1921, close to 60 Progressive and United Farmer of Alberta MPs were elected to Ottawa. In 1921 to 35, the UFA, which was the Progressive affiliate here in Alberta, held government. Elected in 21, held government until 35. In 1922, Manitoba Progressives run candidates in only 2/3 of the ridings and form government. What I'm trying to point out here is the attitude that was sweeping the country. I actually myself never understood Canada or Saskatchewan, my home province, until I spent about 2 weeks one time reading newspapers from the 19-teens and the 20s at the Regina Public Library. And after the Russian Revolution, there were editorials and articles that spoke glowingly of what had happened here. We'll get into more of that in a bit, but that's the dynamic that was unfolding all across the country. It wasn't, and in Alberta, it was dominated. In fact, the source of what became the CCF was not Regina, it wasn't Tommy Douglas, it was actually in Alberta. And I'll show you how it happened. In 1924, now remember, all these guys got elected to Ottawa in 1921. 3 years later, the far left Ginger group formed and split from the Progressive group. And that Ginger group included MPs, these are Alberta MPs, George Coote, Robert Gardner, Edward Garland, Donald Kennedy, and Henry Spencer. Now these are were with these Labour MPs. The Labour MPs that were also part of this Ginger group included Labour MPs William Irvine, him, J.S. Woodsworth, anybody know who he was? He was the founding president of CCF. And Abraham Heaps, who was quite a well-known socialist. The Albertans who were part of this Ginger group run as MPs under the UFA banner after that and were elected. Close ties with Labour and the United Farmers of Ontario is maintained in Ottawa via the Ginger group. The practical political expression of the left, of collectivists, during much of the 20th century was carried by agricultural organizations. Some of you think that guys like myself and a few of my colleagues talk too much about the wheat board. Let me explain to you why it's so significant. Is that the carrier, the expression of the left that was carried in a grassroots sense in the 20th century was carried by agricultural organizations. Labor unions, academics, and the advocates of what we call the social gospel. If you want to talk about who those guys were, we can. But they certainly played a role, but overall it was the influence of aggressive agricultural groups and the ag sector that served as a rudder, always pointed left, of the ship of state. The number of federal MPs from ridings that were predominantly agricultural during this time was higher than from any other single industry or segment of society. In other words, the agricultural left dominated the political culture and their representatives. In 1923, Alberta and Saskatchewan organizations brought Aaron Shapiro from the United States to Canada. Shapiro was an organizer of collectivist efforts. He had developed quite a track record in the United States. He was a lawyer. He spoke all over the place. Apparently this man's eloquence behind a podium was absolutely stunning. And he could persuade people to all kinds of things. He did. In fact, in many cases, he's credited with being the individual who cobbled together what became the Saskatchewan Wheat Pool and played a major role in the Alberta Wheat Pool. using Turner and Waldron's newspaper, which was taken over by the Saskatchewan Wheat Pool eventually, circulation hit 90,000 a week. The purpose of the Western Producer, controlled by these groups, was not news. Turner and Waldron ran the Western Producer, the guys who started the Progressive in 1917. It was the same guys. They knew exactly what they were doing. In 1930, this man, his name is Graham Spry. This guy's the major player. If you don't remember any names when you leave here today, remember this one, Graham Spry. Spry founded the Canadian Radio League in support public broadcasting in order to shape public opinion. This guy's the father of the CBC, is who he is. Using the power of organization, personality, and property to back him, Spry speaks with unions, farm groups, assorted associations, churches, newspapers. He met with university presidents and newspaper editors and public figures in order to promote the idea of the Canadian Radio League, which led to the CBC. In fact, if you go to the CBC Museum today, you'll find the Graham Spry Theatre. That's what that is. Spry favored the United Farmers of Alberta. He later bought their publication and renamed it the New Commonwealth. He also obtained ownership of the Canadian Forum magazine in order to promote an overall political paradigm change. Spry understood exactly what he was doing. He's the father of CBC, reflected in the Spry Theatre at the CBC Museum. Spry used the power sources of personality. Let me skip down here, I don't want to be repetitive. This is significant. The great military strategist Sun Tzu said that the best army is the army that defeats an opponent with the least amount of direct frontal conflict. In other words, if you can beat an opponent with the least amount of direct frontal conflict, that's the best army. Spry understood this concept very well and successfully implemented it. Let me show you. This is the founding meeting of the CCF. It's in Calgary in 1932. In 1932, let's go back here, in 1931,